Hello, and welcome to our October 2022 episode of In Search of Civility. I am Kathy Griesmyer, and I'll be moderating today's discussion with my co-host Kelley Packer. Before we introduce our guests, I'd love to share a little bit of background about our In Search of Civility podcast. This series is an innovative partnership between the Association of Idaho Cities and the Boise Metro Chamber. We started this series back in January 2021 and remain committed to discussing the challenges facing our state and communities here in Idaho. In Search of Civility believes in the idea that truth exists and cannot be found without a sincere exchange of ideas. Civility in our discourse, we believe, is necessary for advancement and preservation of relationships, institutions, and society. To agree, one must first disagree well. Listening actively to key stakeholders, giving your political opponents respect, the benefit of the doubt, empathy, and sympathy for their motives. Ultimately, civility gives us the opportunity for our own idea and notions to change, bringing improvements to our own lives and even society as a whole. We believe civil dialogue can affect great change, which is why we strive to help important conversations take place. These conversations, however, are not possible without the help of our partners. We want to thank today our media partners, Idaho Education News, the Idaho Statesman, the Idaho Press, and the Idaho Capital Sun. They provide us with a platform and audience with whom we can interact. And joining us today for our episode on Is Friendly Fire a Thing? We have two special guests. Kelley, I'll turn it over to you so you can share a little bit more about them. Thanks. Kelley, your mic is muted.
I forgot I had muted, so I apologize for that. We do have two special guests today. Our first guest, Senator Jim Woodward, is a lifelong Idahoan with family history in the state going back to 1908, when his great-grandfather arrived in Elk River. Jim was raised in the northern two counties, where he graduated from Bonners Ferry High School. After high school, he spent a year in Germany as an exchange student. Upon returning from Germany, Jim enrolled at the University of Idaho, where he earned a mechanical engineering degree. Following college, Jim joined the U.S. Navy, serving on a nuclear-powered submarine. He completed 7 years of active duty and 14 years in the reserves. Thank you, Senator Woodward, for your service. Jim and his wife, Brenda, decided to move back to Idaho in 2000 after their first child was born. They have a 23-year-old son and a 16-year-old daughter. His parents are Mike and Jeannie Woodward of Bonners Ferry. Jim has one sister who has battled mental illness since her late teenage years. Jim owns a small construction company specializing in excavation, road construction, utilities installation, natural resource restoration work, and marine construction. For the past 4 years, Jim has been the Idaho State Senator for Legislative District 1, which encompasses all of Boundary County and most of Bonner County. During that time, he served on the Joint Finance and Appropriation Committee, the Senate Education Committee, and the Senate Transportation Committee. Additional assignments included the Line Commission, the Public Defense Commission, chair of the Idaho Council on Indian Affairs, and multiple interim committees. He also serves on the Northern Lights Electric Cooperative Board, the Idaho Consumer-Owned Utilities Board, and as a Fire District Commissioner for the Sagal Fire District. Outside work and public service, Jim loves skiing at Schweitzer or Bogus Basin, flying the Idaho skies as a private pilot, and traveling our lesser-known roads by motorcycle. Welcome, Senator Woodward.
Thank you.
Our second guest, Amy Johnson, serves as the Chief Operating Officer for the St. Luke's Health Plan, a wholly owned subsidiary of St. Luke's Health System based in Boise, Idaho. Prior to joining the inaugural team for the provider-sponsored insurance entity in 2022, Amy worked for 18 years in various healthcare roles for both government and private sector organizations. Most recently, Amy built and led the strategy team for Blue Cross of Idaho as the Director of Strategy, responsible for designing and managing corporate strategy development, business planning and investments, and leveraging new operational and business efficiencies. Working in healthcare IT, Amy led large-scale project teams for Molina Healthcare Incorporated, creating new trademarked products and implementing fiscal agent/TPA services in multiple states across the country. Amy started her healthcare journey working with policymakers at the Idaho legislature as their principal healthcare policy and budget leader, responsible for Medicaid and the state employee health insurance program, as well as other areas of Idaho state government. In this role, she led multiple cross-functional, interagency, and community-based efforts to improve behavioral health services across Idaho and increase quality and efficiency in overall healthcare for Idahoans. Amy grew up in the Pacific Northwest and graduated from Eastern Oregon University with a Bachelor of Science in Business Economics and a Master of Business Administration from Northwest Nazarene University. She is a mom and the first in her family to graduate college. Thus, a strong supporter of kids and education. She served as trustee and chair of the West Ada School Board, Idaho's largest school district, is a past member of the YMCA Child Development Advisory Board, and she volunteers her time supporting students, teachers, and families advancing access to quality education. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelley, for those introductions of our guests that we have joining today. So I'll jump in for our first question. As we kickstart, today's podcast focus, we know that we'll be talking about the shifting dynamics in campaigns and elected office that we're seeing here throughout Idaho. So I want to start by recognizing that you both have held or currently hold an elected position. And we're curious to know, what was the reason you chose to run for public office? Sort of a set the stage question. And Senator Woodward, if we could start with you.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate it. Well, my interest in public office really came later in life, just about 10 years ago. I grew up here in northern Idaho. I had role models. I watched as a child who was taking on those leadership roles in the community, whether the legislature, the city council, or the commissioners. And respected those people. And later in life, as I got started to see some people fill those roles that I didn't quite think had the same value sets and were there for the same motivations, I realized, one, that I still believe in our system of government, both at at the national level, the state level, and the local level. I realized that we have a great system, but it requires participation, and that was what drove me to it. Is that we need good people need to step up. I thought I filled the role there. And I compared myself to those I'd seen as a child, who were business owners, veterans, people out participating in the community. And I thought, well, I guess I better step up and try and take my turn. So put my name in the hat.
Thanks. Kathy, kind of similar. I mean, you run for a school board. It's a volunteer position. You don't get paid. You got to have some reason, right? And mine was really, I just was watching education in the state and looking at kind of all the change, and really, and West Ada being the largest school district, I had kids in the school district, so I was a mom. And I just thought, I have this strategy background and this policy background and all these things and these connections, and I really could help make a difference. And so, rather than be somebody who sat on the outside of the system, to be somebody who moved in and said, how can I help? How can I be involved? I'm, like I said, I'm a firm supporter of education. I love it. I don't want to work, I have so much respect for teachers, and it's not a job I ever feel like I could do because their day is so, they just do such a wonderful job. But I want to help in some way. And so, I was like, I can volunteer my time. And when I made that decision, it was long before COVID became a factor in the conversation. I don't know if I would have made the same decision in the middle of COVID as I did before, but it was really about creating strength in communities around education and helping education strategically look at what the future could look like for our kids.
We appreciate both of you being willing to step up and serve. My dad said that if you ever want to not get paid to lose your friends, the school board is the exact spot to run for service, for community service. And I'm sure COVID just added umpteen million reasons why that is even more true. But thank you both for your willingness to serve. Can you both share with us your experience while you were campaigning, and then maybe what your experience was while serving in office versus that time campaigning? Were there differences, et cetera? Amy, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Senator Woodward.
Yeah. So even though I worked in policy and with the legislature, I'd never actually done anything around campaigns. Like I'd never helped on campaigns. I'd never done anything in that regard. So I had to tap some friends and say, hey, how do I do this? And then probably the thing I was most nervous about was going and knocking on doors. I just thought, I don't know what this is going to be like. And at the end of, I only had a 2-month campaign. School board has a short window. At the time, nobody even knew what a school board trustee did. So, knocking on doors was actually ended up being my favorite part because it was connection to people, which is what I really like. And so campaigning was actually great. I didn't have kind of the battle and the negativity we have today. I did take on an 18-year incumbent, so I did have some challenge. I had to go kind of convince people to get out and vote for a school board trustee at the time that, like, the highest vote count at the time before that was like 500 people in the zone that I was in, and that had about 35,000 voters. So you can see nobody was really engaged. And then to help kind of talk to folks and say, hey, why do you want it? Why does a school board trustee matter to you? And a lot of times folks didn't have kids that I ended up talking to. So it was about property taxes or all the different things that schools actually impact from a community standpoint. That was great. Like, I didn't get very many questions. I got a lot of stuff that was not necessarily related to what a school board trustee could do, but I didn't get any questions, no negativity. People were really welcoming, glad to hear from me, surprised that they had a school board trustee knocking on their door. And then, you switch over to time serving, and really, I had this great community around me. So I had, 64% of the vote came my way, and I had this neighborhood of friends and family and people who just really supported a mom being there for her kids and helping make education better. When COVID hit, that didn't change right away. I actually had a lot of support. I still have a lot of support from the community and the people that know me. So I didn't lose my friends off of being on the school board, which was great, especially during the time of COVID. I think probably most people said, Guy, you picked a really bad time to run. But what did happen, I think probably I would say most, was that people started coming out of the woodwork, frustrated with things that really were not in our control. So what I saw was, first of all, we had a lot of influx of individuals moving into the area that I lived. And where they came from, there was a lot of, I guess I would say, feeling of distrust for government. And that parlayed. So any sort of conversation that I had starting out kind of middle of COVID was immediately met with some distrust, just because that's where folks came from. I can tell you, I probably met with, 300 or 400 different parents, and had way more phone calls than that. And once we had conversations, that changed in every scenario but one. So I think that kind of knowing each other helped, but COVID stopped that from happening because we were all sort of at home. The way people communicated was social media and keyboard warrioring. And so I think that was kind of the biggest change I saw from being able to have that human connection with people campaigning to then losing that for a portion of COVID.
So the question, my experience during campaigning, and I think I had really 3 distinct experiences because I've run 3 times now. First, I guess I would say I agree with Amy that door knocking is a great experience. When you go out and you can talk to an individual and there's always that rational conversation, one-on-one or one with just a few, because you're right there face to face, and that keeps things more civil. When you're a face-to-face conversation almost by nature typically stays that way. But the 3 times I campaigned, the first time around was an unknown, and people looked at my background, and there was some level of trust, I think, and so we got to have those conversations without a voting record. I did. My very first experience was the negative experience, though, was a Facebook comment that I was not used to. I was used to one-on-one conversations and people can get along. And the first time I remember back in 2017 or 18 when I took a Facebook attack, and I couldn't believe it. I ended up searching out that person at that time, and you don't have time anymore to search out all of them. But I also remember my son's comment when I was at home having a conversation with the family, asking, why would this person say something like that? They don't know me. And my son's comment at 17 at the time was just what Amy said. He said, "Oh, Dad, he's just a keyboard warrior," which I didn't have that terminology in my vocabulary. But I think that's certainly something we all experience on the campaign trail or while serving in office, is that the social media or the way we communicate now really has changed the experiences we have. So I think that my first time I ran in 2018 was pretty straightforward. Everything was conversations about the issues. Ran unopposed in 2020, and so of course that simplified it quite a bit. But then this most recent one was a completely different ballgame. And across the state, we saw that in a number of races that not civil at all, and the really I guess what goes on there, what stands out to me is that you have a voting record. People can bring up your voting record, I believe, and talk about that, but when they start to tell people why you did it or what your reasoning was, and they haven't had a conversation with you and they don't know why or what. I voted on numerous bills where I agree with the intent, but the bill is wrong. And so until if the porridge is too hot or the porridge is too cold, go back and get it right. Make the porridge just right so you can have that porridge. When we're writing laws and we're putting them on the books as policy for the state, it's not easy to change again if it's wrong, and it lasts decades or more, then we should get it right the first time. That was some of the experiences in the campaign that as a new person or versus as an incumbent.
Great. Well, thank you both for sharing that experience and kind of having some of that background, both in terms of your campaign experience and then some of the kind of changing factors that you experienced as an elected official serving in your capacity at both the local and state level. Kind of keeping that at front of mind, curious to hear then, given your current experience, what factors do you think have changed to create such an environment of negativity and hostility towards public servants that have really kind of led us to the current state of our political culture here in Idaho right now? And I don't know if Senator Woodward, you want to jump in on this one, then we'll go back over to Amy.
Sure. I have a list, and I think social media has got a great influence. The pandemic, certainly in the last few years. I also think that we had a national leader who encouraged confrontation and divisiveness, and that didn't help anything. That was a role model there, ran down a path that I don't think we consider very civil. I also, at a higher level, the lack of a common external enemy. As a country, we band together during times of where we feel we need to, but when we don't have, and I'm referring to historical events that lasted a long time, like the Cold War, we banded together for a short time after the events of 9/11, but we haven't felt some of those external pressures. And then what Amy said a minute ago too, distrust in the institution of government. And I experienced that also so many times when you talk with somebody. I would answer my phone, and someone who'd moved to the area, and I had my cell phone number on available for everyone, and they would answer it, and I'd say, "Hi, this is Jim," and well, I'd like to speak with the senator. Well, this is Jim. And they were shocked, were surprised. I had a number of conversations where they were surprised they were talking to me. And so we'd have a good conversation and then come away from that, I think, with a better experience for them, something different than what they've dealt with and lived in elsewhere. So those are some of the things I think that have really affected us. Oh, you're muted, Amy.
Jim, you had a great list. Maybe I'll add a little some stats with it because I track this stuff for work mostly. So 51% of the U.S. citizens believe that the media is not trustworthy today, which is a crazy statistic, and that's coming from an Edelman Trust report that they track trust over time. The other, and I find this one interesting, is that 30% of the people get their health information from social media today. So, which is amazing. So I think the disinformation and where we are actually finding our information has created a increase in distrust or an increase in siloing of what information we see, right? So we see on our social media feed what we like and it's built and based on what we want versus actually what's truly out happening in the world. I had an experience when I resigned that was probably something I hadn't really anticipated, and that was just realizing what an echo chamber I lived in. Even though I tried really hard not to live in that and kind of see what was going on, I realized what an echo chamber I live in just because of the position. So what people send to you, what people talk to you about. And sometimes, especially, and I don't know what Jim experienced in that last campaign, but a lot of times what you hear is the negativity and the hostility, right? And so sort of then your echo chamber becomes a lot of that view, and you leave it and you go, holy cow, like a lot less people are paying attention than I realized. And I think that, that is unfortunate because once you get in there and nobody runs for these offices, especially volunteer positions or really low salary positions, to make money. They do it because they want to make a difference. And so I think just the kind of change where we don't trust our government, we don't trust the people in there, it's because we don't know them. And we haven't, one of the things I've loved about Idaho and I loved working at the legislature was you could walk in the Capitol, you could walk to any legislators. At first there was no offices, it was just like spaces on the House floor, but you could walk down to the House floor and see folks. And now you could, even when I left, you could go into the offices. Now I've been in there in the last couple of years, the offices are locked, right? Because we're not sure if the people coming through the doors are going to do something different because of the negativity and the hostility that's out there. And to me, that's really sad because that means we're losing that friendliness of Idaho. And I don't want that to happen.
I think that's a great point, Amy. I've noticed the same thing. I was there kind of in all three of those scenarios, as far as serving when we were easily accessible. And then as we got offices and then, working now, trying to access legislators with the offices locked is a lot harder and a lot less friendly. So do you two think that there is a place for negativity in campaigns? Do we stand to gain something or lose something? What's your feeling about negativity in campaigning? And Amy, let's start with you and then we'll move to Senator Woodward.
So I kind of go a little bit different phrasing. So I do think there's a place for comparing and contrasting in campaigns. So, people are different, and being able to point out your strengths against your opponent or being able to point out your opponent's weaknesses are okay. Where I get to, first of all, I think that's fine. I think when we start attacking the individual, not the issue, is when it becomes, in my mind, that's where I kind of get turned off on it. And then I think the other piece is campaigns are basically, they're a battle, right? You're fighting to win. At the end of the day, you win. The next thing you do is you go and govern. And when you get to the spot where you're going from battling to governing, people have to change what they do. So campaigning is one thing, governing is another. And when they're governing, reason, discourse, civility, conversation, it's no longer an attack. It's a conversation, not necessarily where you agree. In fact, I always enjoyed the conversations where I didn't agree because it gave me more perspective, something that I hadn't thought of. But people get confused on that, and they consider, if you don't agree with me and you won, then now I'm going to just attack you. And I think that's where I go, that's not the way we should work. It'd be better if we could say, okay, now we don't agree. Now I'm going to go convince you why I want you to listen to something that's different than what you thought.
Great point. How about you, Senator Woodward?
No, I really agree with that. I think she got everything that I would say. I think the summary for me is that at the end of the day, people need to remember we're all Idahoans. Hopefully we're working toward this same goal. We have different ideas of how it might be done, but respect the other person in the conduct of a campaign and stick to the issues is great.
Great. Well, thank you both. In thinking too, right, you have the shifting dynamic. It's certainly bringing in, at least at the legislature, a whole host of new lawmakers that are going to be serving this next January. And so given kind of the political culture and the need for committed public servants to run for office at the local and state level, should there be expectations of candidates running for office, sort of basic standards of engagement or political discourse that we should be kind of holding candidates to as they, seek to earn the public's vote and trust, but also are working on issues that are really impacting a number of our communities: education, taxes, housing. The list is pretty long. So, Amy, if we can start with you, your thoughts on expectations for candidates running for office.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of go with the expectations I hold of myself, and everybody else kind of has to set their own expectation, but mine was professionalism, respect for the other person. They're not an enemy, so not seeing your opponent as an enemy. They're another human, right? They're just trying to do what they think is the best thing to do, and so I mean, seeing your opponent that way, I think is something that all elected officials should have a standard of. I think the other piece is listening. So, sometimes it's hard for people to feel you're listening when you are. I learned pretty quickly that I needed to change kind of the dynamic of my own voice in that conversation, but listening is a really key component, and not just listening to the people that agree with you. So those are a couple standards I would suggest. And then, I mean, maybe the third one I would say is compare and contrast with your opponent, but then don't go negative. So.
I really appreciate that distinction between the negativity, but also being able to explain your voting record and how that differs from your opponent and why, voters are looking for options and a candidate that aligns best with their values. So thank you for that distinction. Senator Woodward, your thoughts?
Well, again, agree with what she said. We should hold ourselves to a higher level as a candidate. We're asking to go and fill a position of leadership. We should be able to take pride in that. And so I guess what I see sometimes though is that because of our human nature, what gets rewarded though is in the public eye is what's more emotional or a little bit more dramatic, and that's a culture, part of our culture, I think, or part of us as humans, that some of the behavior that gets covered in the media and gets spread around is what is not the getting the business done, not the day-to-day boring stuff, but people are drawn to the story, and so I don't know how we get past that. That we definitely should, as candidates, behave in an appropriate manner, the same manner as we would act and behave in while holding the office, but that won't get you a headline.
Unfortunately, that's true. And I was talking to a colleague just the other day that was dealing with something similar and had been attacked and misrepresented in the media and on social media. And she was trying to decide if she should even respond. And one of the things that I said to her is, I believe, and I think this goes to Amy's point, that no response is a response, right? So I think that we do need to make sure that we are telling our side of the story, but making sure we keep it respectful. That contrast, right? What's real and what's not. And to your point, Senator Woodward, maybe removing some of the emotions that seem to happen oftentimes on social media and in the news, and actually telling the accurate story. Recognizing where maybe certain points are accurate, but filling in the blanks where something's missing or has taken a wrong course. And I guess so to that point, and Senator Woodward, we'll start with you and then move to Amy. We talked about levels of engagement or standards of engagement, I should say, for candidates and those that are actually in office. But what about the public? Do you feel like that there's a standard that the public should also recognize and try to hold to, so that to help with this kind of search of civility that we're talking about? And what would those look like?
Well, I'd certainly like to see that. That would be the ideal. But I think that's part of our culture. But the other part of that is education. And oftentimes people aren't searching out the information, but it's being provided to them. And so we have some of the further fringe groups are really good at communicating a message, and it gets people, oftentimes it's a message that gets people fired up. So I think that while as a candidate, a moderate or a middle of the road candidate, we have to get better as candidate and as an office holder, get better at talking about our message. And it's not going to be as exciting or dramatic, but if the public is our boss, then we have to, as a candidate or an office holder, then we have to get out there and tell those people what we've done. And so the telling of the story, and to gain both to let people know, but to then so that they have that information so they can make good decisions. And so that it becomes a communications exercise, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And I think that's where it's easy to fail.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure the good senator had no better campaign communications staffer than I did, which was zero, right? Like we had, you're working, you're running a business, you're trying to volunteer your time, and you're at the whim of basically, organizations that have whole communications teams that have large amounts of funding that also don't have any accountability put back on them unless you're there yourself fighting for the accountability. So you just kind of have to go, like, some of it you have to let go, and you hope that the folks in the public go, hey, that's one story, let me see where I can find another one and see what I think. And back to your point about kind of the negativity in campaigns, I think one of the things I experienced was some negativity, some very inaccurate information. And what I found was the mainstream media even didn't do the research behind those stories. And so they just printed the story because we want to get out fast, right? It's something happening right now. And I talked to all the folks later about, hey, understand you guys want a headline, but when you put a headline out with misinformation, and it just creates more distrust, and it creates more challenge, and it puts people in a position of having to defend information that wasn't even accurate to begin with, and you're the mainstream media, right? And so I think, not having communication staff, I think what I would ask, from the public, like, I think the citizens have to have a standard for themselves, right? I don't know what, I have a standard for myself. I look at multiple pieces of information. I try and look at things that aren't necessarily something I agree with to understand where the other side's coming from. But each individual person has to have that standard for themselves. I would just ask that everybody have the standard that represents Idaho well. And I think that's probably where I'm most sad about right now, because I think Idaho has been my home for 20 years, and I've seen what folks think of Idaho when I leave the state just degrade a little bit because of the way that we are handling ourselves.
Absolutely. And if I may, Kathy, I'm sorry, I'm going to just put a fine point on what Amy just said as far as, the media making sure that they get their information accurate. We recently saw an article in one of our main papers that talked about one of our cities not having a mayor or council and hadn't had it for, a year or so. And we were like, what? I swear I just talked to that mayor. So I instantly got on the phone and called and said, did something happen? They were like, no, we're still here. But they had just taken a story from somebody that had their own private agenda about property in that area and ran with it without finding out. And so we reached out to them and said, can you write this story? Because this isn't accurate. They've never been without a mayor or council. And here's the information if you'd like to call them, which they did, to their credit. But just take that extra few minutes to verify a story before you put it out, both personally and if you're mainstream media. Kathy, I apologize. Thank you.
No, thank you for that point, Kelley. And I was reflecting on what Amy and Senator Woodward had shared around, public engagement and kind of how they've maneuvered through their own constituents coming and meeting with them. As somebody who's done a number of trainings for various community groups around engaging with elected officials, advice we're always offering is elected officials are people just like you and me, who should always be respected and, are giving a lot of their time to serve. And I think it's important at the end of the day to remember these are people who are working for the betterment of our community as well, and being able to engage in respectful, humane dialogue always goes so much further in advocating for your own opinion if you're trying to inform or educate or ask for a particular vote on something. But I think Senator and Amy, both of your comments sort of reaffirm that we just want to have conversations with our neighbors and respectful dialogue and an opportunity to learn. And it makes us all better for that at the end of the day. Moving on to my next question, we're curious to know kind of your ideas around, are there mechanisms at the state or local election level that we could be better utilizing both for candidates and for donors around engaging in a more honest and ethical way in our Idaho elections? I have a two-part question, so I'm going to pause there because that first one was kind of long. I'll repeat it again. Are there mechanisms at the state or local level that can be better utilized to ensure candidates and donors are engaging in an honest and ethical way? I'll start with you, Senator Woodward, then we'll jump to Amy, and then I'll ask my part two since it's kind of involved.
Well, I think we have to come up with some enforcement mechanisms for some of the pieces we have in place already. An example of that might be electioneering at the polls. I think our current code says that you can't do any campaigning within 100 feet of the polls. What we saw in at least in the northern three counties, and I think it happened in other places, were a station set up, a table with a couple people at a precinct polling location, a rural precinct polling location, where you had to get past that table to get into the parking lot at the local Grange Hall or whatever small building it is. So they might be 150 feet away from the building where the voting is going to take place, but they're at a point where you have to come past. And so there were the recommended list of Republican candidates for the primary, and that happened at every precinct location in Kootenai County, Bonner County, and Boundary County. And so people, what I sometimes refer to as the low information voter, they're going to vote because it's their civic duty, but they're not really engaged and don't know who the candidates are. They're handed a list and they've got a test to take, and they just got the cheat sheet. In they went, and there was no enforcement of that because by the letter of the law, they were outside 100 feet. And so that was definitely an effective mechanism for the group that was using that this year. That sign location, I would reaffirm that we have to make sure that the signs that are in the right of way, they come down. That's what happens, at least in this county, that you have to go over to the transportation department yard and pick up your sign and go find a better place for it because it's on the ground out in the back of the shop. So those are a couple of examples of things that go on that we don't have any real enforcement of, I think, right now. And we saw the campaign finance report that went in this year. If people aren't familiar with that, businessman out of Boise, fairly large contributor to a lot of campaigns, and didn't actually meet the campaign finance requirements, and that we were allowed to donate $1,000 as an individual to a candidate, and then your spouse can donate another $1,000, and then a business entity can also. But if the controlling interest in the business entity, that's redundant. And if you have multiple business entities, not each of those business entities can contribute if you're controlling all those. And so those campaign contributions were in violation of our Idaho campaign finance law. The candidates were told how to redistribute that money and put it on against the general election, or give themselves a loan to cover that money. So we got the paperwork right, but I don't think the intent of the law was met when those campaign contributions were made that were greater than the allowed limit. So we straightened it up afterward, but there was no mechanism in place there. There was no enforcement of what was really a violation of campaign finance law.
So in talking, Senator, you're mentioning campaign finance, electioneering. If you had to think of what would be the most critical change we could be making to elections, what would you recommend?
Give me a moment. Maybe Amy can answer something. I'll think about that.
That sounds great. Go ahead, Amy. And if you'd like me to repeat the question, I'm happy to do so. Otherwise, go ahead and jump in.
No, I can jump in. So I want to kind of drive home something that Senator Woodward said, because I think it's been I've been watching it for a little while now and wondering how this is going to work. And that's enforcement of the regulations we have in place today. Like, who is enforcing that, and how are we ensuring that the elections are honest? We hear a lot about improper voting, but we even had an individual who was within the 150 feet at a school here in the Treasure Valley campaigning this last in the primary. So who enforces that, and what happens for that election cycle, right? And I don't know that we have an answer to those questions, because we've never really had to experience that. People just always followed the rules before. We've always been honorable about it in Idaho and followed the rules. And now we have folks that either don't know the rules and aren't following them, or are actually deciding to not follow the rules and just campaign the way they feel is the way they want. That requires some enforcement, and I'm not sure that that we've been in this boat before, but I think it's something that we need to consider from an accountability standpoint. And I have a couple kind of accountability pieces. There's really no nonpartisan, impartial source of truth around a voter guide in Idaho. We get a voter guide, but it's really around the initiatives, but it's not around the candidates. And so I'd love to see Idaho at some point go to a voter guide where we have the resume of the candidates, and we also have some sort of pro for the candidate, some sort of con, and the reasons why, the compare and contrast, that is nonpartisan, that's put out. In states that I've looked at this, it's typically done by the Secretary of State's office, and the candidates involved in selecting both their pro and con and then putting their resume in place. But it gives you a bunch better ideas. So, because a lot of, as Senator Woodward mentioned, low-informed voters go in, they don't actually even know who's all on the ballot, right? So you get in there and then you just pick somebody. And if somebody hands you a list on the way in the door, that gives you a name you might want to pick if you trust the person going in the door. So I think, a voter guide would be a good voter's guide would be nice, not one put out by the media. And then, I think there's probably the last piece of it Senator Woodward said this, transparency in funding, but what I'm watching is a lot of folks forming new, not PACs, but actually C4s, where they can collect the funding. They don't have to have the transparency in the funding, and they're using that to put out information around elections or candidates that maybe isn't accurate. And I think Idaho has to consider whether or not that's really what we believe is fair election process. So I would add that to the transparency in funding.
Okay, well,
I can add. Yep, happy to add just a little bit more. I'm sorry. I'll answer the question from before. So, Kathy, I think that what Amy just said, that's what I came to the conclusion of, that combination of different types of nonprofits in the same office space with the same people on staff. There's no real distinction between who is in which or what time of the day they're working on what activity, whether it's part of that reportable side or the non-reportable side, I think that's causing us some problems. So I think campaign finance law, Senator Patty Ann Lodge, who just retired after 22 years of service, worked and had some proposals on that, and I just didn't make it through the process here. But hopefully someone can pick up the ball and move with that at some point.
And I think I can't speak for Senator Woodward, but I would speak for myself and say that's on all sides. I don't think that's something that we say one party. I mean, that's for all of us. I think I would say doesn't matter which party or who's involved. That transparency and being able, not using mechanisms to get around the laws is something that we should look at.
One final comment, Kathy. I have had conversations with our candidate for Secretary of State, Phil McGrain. So we'll put him on, obligate him to this now, but he intends to create a voter's guide out of the Secretary of State's office. I think we'll see that in the future here, which will be a great improvement for us here in Idaho.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both for your feedback and ideas on, some ideas that the legislature might be able to look at come next January. I'll turn it over to Kelley for our final question.
Thank you, Kathy. Really, this question is simply, what advice would you give people that are running for office right now, especially in the existing environment that we're facing? What advice would you give them for navigating our elections in Idaho at this point? Amy, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Senator Woodward.
Okay, I have some advice and I have a request. So advice is just read a lot and just make as much connection to people as possible. I think that I found the most rewarding part of the job was connection to individuals and hearing their stories and then figuring out how I could help. So that would be my advice. My request is, and I think most of the folks, we're going to have this huge turnover in the legislature, no matter what. And I think that we have to start protecting our public officials. So my request is to really look at that. It doesn't mean that we protect access to them, which is kind of happening naturally. They're limiting access. But we start protecting them from being harassed at their home, being harassed by, at their places of employment, or with their business owners at their business. That we have to look at some way to protect our public and elected officials, so that when they're in there doing the business of the people, they're our employees. It's just like you would protect your employee at your own company. We gotta protect people so that when they're in office, they can do the job that they're there to do, and also not be harassed into voting or appointing or putting somebody in a position one way or the other because of all of the noise that's coming at them. I just saw that article Commissioner Beck said, we put somebody on the public health board to calm the noise. That's not the reason. That's not what we want our elected officials making a decision on, is calming the noise. We want them to make the decision to put people in right appointed positions because that's the right place for them. That's good for the community and the county. That's not. But I understand the pressure that comes with that noise. And so I think we have to figure out how to protect people from that pressure. And it's usually not, hey, I don't agree with you. It's a lot of more of a hostile, I can't even describe it, but harassment style pressure.
I would say to everyone, whether they're considering being a candidate or not considering being a candidate or are, get out there and take your turn at it. I said early on, the system we have requires participation. And so whether you do it for just a few years or a longer time, the reason our system of government allows us our freedoms, it gives us this place where we can have the jobs we love and have a productive life, and also have that recreational time. And those things can go away quickly if we don't tend to the business of government, taking care of the day-to-day items. And it doesn't have to always be about the ideological battle. Some of it is very rewarding, just like a job can be very rewarding, that you're getting something done and taking care of for the community. In the Navy, we talked about the 90-10 rule. 10% of the items take up 90% of your time. And that's what is going on sometimes here, that we're going to forget about the 90% and focus on the 10% that draws all the attention, but we better get the 90% done so that everything stays in place. To keep Idaho keep it the way we like it here.
So if I might add just one more thing, for people running for office, I think you got some really great models, and one of them is Senator Jim Woodward. So I want to tell a little story about him because, and he knows the story because he was part of it. I had never met him ever, didn't know him. Northern Idaho legislator. I didn't lobby, so I didn't have any reason to know him. But after all of kind of the experience that I went through, I got this thank you note from Senator Woodward, just thanking me for my time, my service, and what I had done for West Ada. And I think anybody running for office should know that that's the type of model of person that we want in. So,
thank you for sharing that. He is a great man.
That is a really kind story to end on, and just thanking both of you for your time in public office, for sharing your stories today. I know you both have served during a very wild time in national and state history with COVID and the most recent presidential election and everything that's sort of come out of the changing environment we find ourselves in today. So thank you both for your service, for your willingness to share your story today in talking about how everything is changing and what we're looking for as folks continue to engage in our political discourse, both as members of the public as well as elected officials running for office. So thank you. In closing, I do also want to thank the Association of Idaho Cities and the Boise Metro Chamber, along with our media partners, Idaho Education News, the Idaho Statesman, the Idaho Press, and Capital Sun. In Search of Civility is taking a short pause. We'll be back after the end of the holiday season and legislative session next year, so stay tuned. We'll be making our debut in 2023 back in April, so keep watching, and we're looking forward to seeing you all then. Otherwise, wishing you all a happy Monday and a productive week. Thank you all.
thank you.